Imagine owning a car so rare that the Japanese government would send investigators to your door if they discovered you were trying to export it. For over 50 years, this mythical Japanese performance car remained imprisoned within its homeland's borders. Enthusiasts who attempted to export originals faced criminal charges. Collectors offered millions just to smuggle one out. The few that escaped Japan were shells with replica parts, their souls left behind. If you're new here, this channel specializes in uncovering automotive forbidden fruit. Hit subscribe right now, because after watching this video, I guarantee you'll want more automotive secrets revealed. This is the 1969 Nissan Skyline GT-R KPGC10, the first-generation Hakosuka that birthed the most revered bloodline in Japanese performance history. Before the R32, R33, or R34 became PlayStation legends, this was the original Godzilla, a car so dominant it won 50 consecutive races and forced Japanese officials to change the rules, just to give others a chance. But here's what makes this story extraordinary. Unlike Italian exotics or American muscle cars that spread globally, the Japanese government and Nissan themselves considered these cars national treasures. They implemented export restrictions, regulations, and cultural taboos designed specifically to keep original GTRs in Japan forever. Fewer than 2,000 were built. Experts estimate fewer than 500 survive today. And until 2008, you could count on one hand how many documented numbers-matching examples existed outside Japan. What makes a car so special that an entire nation mobilizes to prevent its export? What technological secrets did it contain that Japan wanted to protect? And how did this forbidden fruit finally escape its homeland's grasp? If you've ever wondered why the letters GTR command more respect than almost any other performance badge, this forgotten chapter in automotive history holds the answer. The year was 1969. America was landing on the moon. Meanwhile, in Japan, a small team of engineers was about to create automotive history with a car nobody outside their homeland would see for decades. This is the untold story of the 1969 Skyline GT-R, the forbidden JDM legend that finally escaped Japan. What made the Hakosuka GT-R special wasn't its modest exterior. It was what lurked beneath, technology so advanced that many believe it's why Japan restricted these cars from export. At the heart of every Hakosuka GT-R was the legendary S20 engine. While ordinary Skylines used pedestrian L-series motors, the GT-R received something extraordinary, a 2.0-liter straight-six, with technology directly descended from the Prince R380 racing program. This wasn't just another Japanese engine. The S20 featured dual overhead camshafts when most production cars used pushrods. It had 4 valves per cylinder when 2 was standard. It used triple Mikuni Solex side draft carburetors when most sports cars made do with a single carburetor. Each S20 engine was hand-built by specially trained technicians who needed to pass years of apprenticeship before touching these motors. A single engine took over 25 hours to assemble, more time than many manufacturers spent building an entire car in 1969. The result was remarkable: 160 horsepower from just 2 liters of displacement. For comparison, a 1969 Mustang needed 5 liters to produce similar power. The S20 could rev safely to 7,500 RPM, when most production engines couldn't exceed 5,500 RPM without risk of failure. But raw power wasn't what made the S20 special. It was the power delivery, linear, responsive, and with an exhaust note that Japanese enthusiasts describe as mechanical music. The engine's willingness to rev and its throttle response were decades ahead of competitors. The chassis was equally advanced. While most Japanese cars of the era used simple live-axle rear suspensions, the GT-R featured fully independent, semi-trailing arm rear suspension, the same basic design used in Porsches of the period. The body structure was reinforced specifically for racing, with strategic strengthening that added minimal weight but significantly improved torsional rigidity. The front McPherson strut suspension was tuned for neutral handling rather than the understeer common in most production cars. Drivers who experienced the GT-R in competition described it as having perfect balance. Unlike American muscle cars that excelled in straight lines or European sports cars that demanded precision, the GT-R was forgiving at the limit while maintaining exceptional capability. The GT-R also featured a 5-speed manual transmission when most sports cars offered only 4 speeds. This allowed for both better acceleration and more relaxed highway cruising, though few GT-Rs were driven gently. Each Hakosuka GT-R was built on a separate production line from standard Skylines. Specialized workers performed additional welding, reinforcement, and assembly procedures that couldn't be integrated into the main production process. Externally, only subtle differences distinguish the GT-R from ordinary Skylines. The distinctive fender flares, now iconic, were actually quite restrained by today's standards. A small GT-R badge on the C-pillar was often the only indication that this wasn't a typical Japanese sedan. This subtle appearance, combined with extraordinary performance, created the perfect racing machine. From 1969 through 1972, the Hakosuka GT-R dominated Japanese touring car championships, winning an unprecedented 50 consecutive races, a record that remains unbroken in major motorsport. This domination became problematic. Race organizers eventually modified regulations specifically to handicap the GT-R. Additional weight penalties were imposed. Restriction plates were required on carburetors. Despite these handicaps, the GT-R continued winning, but racing success couldn't save the original GT-R from progress. By 1972, increasingly strict emissions regulations made the hand-built S20 engine commercially unviable. The racing landscape was also changing, with turbocharged cars beginning to dominate motorsport. Production ended in 1972 after just 1,945 examples. The GT-R name would go dormant for 16 years before being revived for the R32 generation. During this hiatus, the original cars began their transformation from used race cars to revered collector pieces. But what happened to these cars after production ended is where our story takes an unexpected turn. While most performance cars spread globally through exports and gray market imports, the Hakosuka GT-R remained almost exclusively in Japan, by design, not accident. After production ended in 1972, something unprecedented happened to surviving Hakosuka GT-Rs. While most classic performance cars depreciated before becoming collectible decades later, the GT-R never experienced this typical decline. By the late 1970s, prices for clean, original GT-Rs were already climbing in Japan. Enthusiasts who recognized their significance began hoarding well-maintained examples. Racing veterans sought out their former competition cars. A cult following emerged that would preserve these machines while keeping them hidden from international attention. But why didn't they spread globally like other Japanese performance cars? The answer involves 3 interconnected factors: government regulations, cultural attitudes, and corporate policy. First, Japan's Ministry of Transportation maintained strict regulations about exporting vehicles considered important cultural assets. The Hakosuka GT-R, having dominated motorsport and established Japan's performance credibility, fell into this protected category beginning in the mid-1970s. Attempting to export an original GT-R with its numbers-matching S20 engine would trigger automatic inspection and likely denial. Customs officials were specifically trained to identify S20-powered vehicles attempting to leave the country. The few that made it out legally had their original engines replaced with standard L-series motors. Second, a powerful cultural taboo developed around exporting these cars. Japanese collectors considered the GT-R part of their national automotive heritage, something to be preserved within Japan. Selling to foreign buyers became viewed as dishonorable, regardless of the price offered. Third, and perhaps most significantly, Nissan themselves implemented a quiet policy of reacquiring important GT-Rs whenever possible. Through their heritage division, they began purchasing historically significant examples to prevent foreign acquisition. They maintained first right of refusal on many privately owned cars through special arrangements with prominent collectors. The chassis was equally advanced. While most Japanese cars of the era used simple live-axle rear suspensions, the GT-R featured fully independent semi-trailing arm rear suspension, the same basic design used in Porsches of the period. The body structure was reinforced specifically for racing, with strategic strengthening that added minimal weight but significantly improved torsional rigidity. The front McPherson strut suspension was tuned for neutral handling rather than the understeer common in most production cars. Drivers who experienced the GT-R in competition described it as having perfect balance. Unlike American muscle cars that excelled in straight lines or European sports cars that demanded precision, the GT-R was forgiving at the limit while maintaining exceptional capability. The GT-R also featured a 5-speed manual transmission when most sports cars offered only 4 speeds. This allowed for both better acceleration and more relaxed highway cruising, though few GT-Rs were driven gently. Each Hakosuka GT-R was built on a separate production line from standard Skylines. Specialized workers performed additional welding, reinforcement, and assembly procedures that couldn't be integrated into the main production process. Externally, only subtle differences distinguished the GT-R from ordinary Skylines.